All right, so I think everything's set up now, and we should jump right in. You may recognize that the images on the slide are identical to the ones that I used last week, although I have reversed their placement and size, and that is because I believe perhaps the most consequential thing in American politics that happened in the last 10 days, and these have been 10 days that have been unrelenting in the development of important news, is actually something that came in John Roberts' Supreme Court decision in the case of Donald J. Trump versus the United States, the presidential immunity case, and the decision that was announced Monday, so not quite a week ago, just a couple days after we spoke last week, which carved out substantial immunity from legal prosecution for the President of the United States, for whoever sits in the Oval Office and occupies the power and authority that comes with that position, for violation of the laws of the United States, right? This is, I think, a sea change in American constitutional law to give you a sense of how, I think, dramatic and unanticipated this decision is based on where American law was 6 months ago to 200 years ago. Uh, Legal scholar Melissa Murray of NYU, one of the leading authorities on the Constitution, and in particular this question of presidential power, was interviewed on the morning of the oral arguments of this case. And so this was before we heard some of the questioning, which I think caused many of us to be alarmed. Murray said, and this is a paraphrase, that she didn't think any legal scholar believed that the Supreme Court would be convinced by Donald Trump's lawyers' arguments. And it turns out that 6 out of 9 justices were mainly convinced by those arguments that if the President of the United States does it, as Richard Nixon famously put it, then it's not illegal, then it's not a crime. And so the focus of today's lecture is going to still be on the state of the presidential election. There's more information today than there was a week ago. I want to bring you up to date on that. But the state of the presidential election in light of this Supreme Court decision, what's happened in the last week, which is the increased likelihood that Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States, and increased from a coin flip, already a 50-50 chance, to, on many estimates, a two-thirds, three-quarters chance that the next president of the United States will be someone who brought a case against, right, the Justice Department and the special prosecutor, claiming that he was immune from prosecution, prevailed in that case, is therefore not going to be tried for having tried to overturn, or at least allegedly having tried to overturn, the results of the last presidential election. There's a growing likelihood that he will be the next president of the United States and will be substantially unconstrained as president. And so we need to bring these two together with greater emphasis on the Supreme Court today. So first, a little bit about the presidential election. And I have a little bit more data on the board and some more updated information for you based on the last week's polls, but also some of the information that I think is most significant. And so starting with these models that try to determine the likelihood of the outcome of the electoral college vote, which actually determines who the next president of the United States will be. So they build in a fair bit more information than just a national public opinion poll. We see that 538, which tends to be most favorable to Joe Biden has now tilted away from the coin flip territory and into a substantially increased chance that Donald Trump wins the next election. I've also put on the board the model developed by the economist Nate Silver. I don't believe has updated his model since last week, but the economist is updating theirs daily. And the economist model, similar to the 538 model, looking at state by state polling data, looking at economic factors and other uh, political fundamentals, give Donald Trump about a three-quarters chance of prevailing in the next election. And I do think that the fundamental issue, but it's not the only fundamental issue, we'll get a little bit more in detail into this, is that concerns about Joe Biden's age that were already taking shape. And I want to go back as far as 2022, as it became clear that he was providing less access to the media, granting fewer interviews, doing fewer press conferences, apparently walking more gingerly and being less active. These concerns about his age predate the performance in the presidential election, as is demonstrated by this poll, which is over 6 months old, where three-quarters of Americans say that they feel that Joe Biden is just too old to be an effective president. And that's almost double the number who say the same thing about Donald Trump. I'm not going to judge the fairness, the appropriateness of this judgment. One of the things that political analysts, talking heads say about 21st century electoral politics is you need to meet the voters where they are. If you're trying to get the voters to change their mind about something that they're kind of mind made up about, you have a very hard time reaching them and convincing them. This is part of the social media and cable news fragmentation of our public sphere. They can easily be confirmed in believing what they already believe. So you have to do more to meet the voters where they are. The voters were convinced prior to Thursday night's debate that Joe Biden is too old to be president of the United States. And I just want to go back for a moment and think about Joe Biden of 2020, right? Joe Biden of 2020 does not appear to have the limitations, the way in which he's been diminished by the demands of this office, and the way in which he has apparently worked himself feverishly around meeting the demands of this office, and the toll that it's taken perhaps on his health and his capacity to effectively communicate. Leadership, decisiveness, eloquence, they seem to have been substantially undermined. But remember that in 2020, Joe Biden was campaigning against Donald Trump in the first year of a global pandemic, before vaccines had been created and disseminated. And the result is that Biden really didn't engage in a traditional retail politics kind of campaign. He did not have an in-person convention. He did not have an in-person rally. If the were rallies that he attended, he had people pull up in their cars, but most of his campaigning occurred over the TV, over the teleprompter, in an environment that was very friendly to someone who throughout his career has not been known especially for eloquence. And so in 2020, Joe Biden, in a sense, was able to not have to play to what might have been one of his main liabilities. This is not the case in 2024. And Joe Biden won in 2020 in part because he was perceived by most Americans as not having many liabilities. They were not enthusiastically supporting Joe Biden, but they were very worried about the level of chaos coming out of the Oval Office under Donald Trump's leadership, and they were looking for a consensual, moderate, competent alternative. Joe Biden fit the bill. I have on the board today the approval ratings of Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And so Donald Trump is in the middle. And I want you to notice, right, that Donald Trump's unfavorability rating is in the low 50s. His favorability rating is in the low 40s. This would normally be fatal to an ordinary politician. Donald Trump is not an ordinary politician. He's a populist, and America is not ordinary. I just noticed for a moment that elections occurred in Britain a couple days ago, right? And right 4 weeks after the prime minister called a snap election, we have a new prime minister in Downing Street who has already assembled a cabinet, right? And in the United States, our elections occur in slow motion with primaries and a long time between the primaries and the nominating convention and a long time between the nominating convention and the general elections. This weakens our parties. This makes us incredibly dependent on donors. Conversation for another day, why our campaigns are structured the way they are. But coming back to the core idea, right? Donald Trump has very low favorability, but very stable. Look at how stable those lines are across a 2+ year period. Now look at Joe Biden, right? And so really only recently has Joe Biden's approval rating dipped below Donald Trump's. This is just a development of the last month. His disapproval rating is now substantially higher than Donald Trump's, and there's clear direction, right? I mean, it's hard to miss. And in particular, in the last year, right, it's not just that the withdrawal from Afghanistan damaged Joe Biden substantially, that the doubts about his age really began to take hold, that this is a hard election period in the democratic world for incumbents in general. People are unhappy with what government can't do for them, and therefore they tend to blame the incumbent. That is all right, dragging Joe Biden down. But then over the last year, his disapproval rating is growing, his approval rating is shrinking, and he's now less favorable than Donald Trump. This is a recipe for defeat to a very unpopular candidate. And so let me just explore this metaphor for a moment, that there's a hole in President Biden's sail. And so the idea here is that in the current circumstances, Joe Biden should have the wind at his back, right? We got crime data. The rate of violent crime in the United States in the last year was at a 50-year low. We got more employment data, another robust period of job growth. Joe Biden has really consolidated his standing as one of the great job creators in the history of the presidency. Our economy is not working well for the bottom 50%. We'll say more about that, but our economy is doing better than the economy of almost any other developed country in the world. And an effective communicator, a president who was eloquent and capable of delivering his message in a way that got through to the electorate should be able to take credit for policies that have helped to buoy the American economy and are beginning to bear fruit even for the people who are more precarious in our economy. Joe Biden is no longer able to do that. He's no longer able to effectively deliver his lines. He's no longer able to effectively make the case for himself or the case against Donald Trump. And I'm going to say, I think there's a scenario in which Joe Biden, if he remains in this race, wins the election. But I think it's becoming an increasingly long shot. We shouldn't completely despair if Joe Biden doesn't get out of this race, but he would either have to turn things around in a way that frankly seems incredibly improbable at this point, right? We watched the interview with Stephanopoulos and maybe a little bit better than the performance in the debate, but still not very convincing. We're hearing growing reports out of the White House that Joe Biden seems to have lost a step, to have become a little bit confused, to struggle at points in large meetings. And we know that people with speech impediments sometimes find themselves particularly tongue-tied when they get into situations that make them nervous about their capacity to perform. By the way, it's not just people with speech impediments. That seems to be a liability of the human mind and what cortisol, et cetera, does to us, the fight or flight reflex that sets in when our anxiety level goes up. All of this to say, I don't see what Joe Biden can do to really turn this around. He's not going to run a marathon in record time for his age group. He's not going to instantly become the kind of politician he's never been. And so I do think, and we talked about this last week, I'm not going to talk about it more this week, but the Democratic Party really needs to begin. The donor class needs to begin. The elected officials and Joe Biden's brain trust, his family, his loved ones, all need to start making the case to Joe Biden. This is not necessarily fair, right? Joe Biden maybe should have got the nod from Barack Obama in 2016 and be concluding his second term as president. But having said that, life is not always fair. Joe Biden has had a very successful first term as president. The thing that he could do to eclipse that, to prevent that from being his legacy at the end of a long and accomplished career in American politics would be to stay in this race as a matter of vanity or pride, as a apparently deluded old man who thinks that he can do better than he can, and be remembered as the Democrat who gave Donald Trump a second term in office. And I have a fantasy for Joe Biden. You know, it's a double-barreled fantasy. He says he wants to take a cognitive competency test, and he challenges Donald Trump to take one as well. Hopefully suckers Donald Trump into doing so, and knowing that Biden is going to drop out. But my more, I think, realistic fantasy is that Joe Biden becomes the leader of the anti-Trump movement outside of American government. And the title of today's lecture, right, today's class, is that our institutions may not be able to save us from our politics. When the last time we had a populist, nativist, uh, trending autocratic or authoritarian movement in the United States, we also had labor unions. We also had much higher rates of participation in civic associational life. We need not just to have the president not be a populist autocrat at a point where the Supreme Court has given a green light to the vast expansion of executive power. We also need our ordinary people to be organized to resist the tendency in our politics in a nationalist, nativist, autocratic, populist direction. Joe Biden could do more good at this point in his career leading that movement than running for the presidency of the United States, right? And what we're seeing in the polls, right, is that it looks increasingly like Trump, even in the very favorable to Biden 538 model, is ahead in the Electoral College, that he's growing his lead in the national opinion polls, that he is ahead in every swing state. This is from The Economist, that Biden needs to win the presidency, ahead in Michigan, ahead in Wisconsin, ahead in Pennsylvania. And right, to be as clear as possible about this, I think the chief claim that Biden made in 2020 is that he was the best Democrat to beat Donald Trump. In 2024, that does not appear to be the case anymore. And so it's not just that age has opened a hole in the sail that, with the wind at his back, is likely to get bigger as this campaign goes on. It is also that he is making a case that is manifestly no longer convincing in 2024. It appears that Kamala Harris has moved ahead of Joe Biden in neck-to-neck polls with Donald Trump. And I don't want to suggest that that means that she should be the pick of the Democrats. I think we need a robust, compressed, genuine contest if Joe Biden is going to get out of this race to determine who the candidate for the Democratic Party should be. But frankly, part of the reason Joe Biden is still in this race, despite having campaigned in 2020 as a bridge to the future, right? Not an 8-year president, but a 4-year president, is because there's this worry that Kamala Harris is not up to the task and that a fight for the presidency within the party might be damaging to the Democratic Party. I just think after Thursday night's debate, after seeing what it's doing to the polling, and in light of these long-term trends with the approval rating of the president, this is no longer convincing. And so I hope that those who have Joe Biden's ear are trying to get him to see this is not like running for the president when you're not yet the nominee, where yes, you maintain your faith and you continue to campaign even after you've lost some initial primaries. You have the nomination and it looks like you're going to lose the general election. It's not too late to correct course. And I do think among the worries, right, we look at what's happening in the swing states that have Senate races. We can see that the Democrats are actually ahead in Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. In all those states, Joe Biden is behind. And so this suggests two things. The first is that this is not an election that the Democrats in general are struggling to win. This is an election that Joe Biden is struggling in. And second of all, please remember what happened in 2016. Hillary Clinton was a very unpopular Democrat. She still won the popular vote, but the fact that she did not evince enthusiasm from her supporters dragged Democrats down ballot, down. And the result is that Donald Trump not only won the presidency, but Republicans controlled Congress. And with the federal judiciary already in the middle of a very important restructuring from the top, I think another 4 years of a Donald Trump presidency, especially if there were 2 years of control of the Senate in the mix, could be incredibly transformative for American politics. It could change the very character of constitutional interpretation still further than it has already been changed by the radicalism of the Roberts Court after the Trump appointees. So we've talked about this before, no need to reiterate. The economy is not great for the bottom 50%, despite the fact that looking at it from the macro level, this has been a remarkable recovery from the COVID caused recession. But that's not, I think, the best way to look at this economy. The best way to look at this economy is from a long term structural perspective of what has happened to the distribution of wealth and income and what that has done for average Americans, especially Americans who do not have a college education, for their economic success, their standing, their sense of whether or not this society cares about their well-being. This is the diagram that shows we've come back to the levels of inequality of the Gilded Age, with the top 10% again controlling 50% of the national income. What this means in practice is that roughly half of Americans are trying to live on $30,000 a year or less, that they have, according to the Federal Reserve, $400 in savings or less, that they have, as a result of inflation, increased credit card debt, decreased solvency. And so, if you're in this large group of Americans for whom the last 50 years have undermined your economic security, and the last 4 years of inflation have undermined your solvency, your purchasing power, you increasingly conclude that prosperity is unattainable for people like you in the richest country in the world. That the government, as currently constituted, lacks the capacity or responsiveness to help people like you, and that your society, as it has become more diverse and as the educated class has done better and come to care more about racial justice, Black lives, immigrants, criminal justice issues, that we lack the social cohesion to help those who are suffering most. And these conclusions then, I think, I hope, help to explain why 40% of the American public so strongly approves of Donald Trump. He is conveying a message to them that the political system as a whole, the economic system as a whole, has failed them, and he is willing to say that out loud, but not only that, to repair it, right? And so the idea that this is credible in the 21st century, I think, is something that we need to take seriously, even if we do not believe that Donald Trump is the person, has the capacities, has the ideas, in fact, to restore faith in American government or to introduce the reforms we do, in fact, need. Part of what makes, right, Donald Trump viable is that economic policy, and I've got my old books on the slide again talking about the shift of economic policy out of Congress and into the Federal Reserve, with the incapacity of a polarized Congress to pass meaningful legislation, that the result of this has been a top skewed pattern of economic growth. And we see this very clearly. Two-thirds of the wealth in our society belongs to the top 10% of the wealthiest Americans. The bottom 50% own around 2% of the wealth. Stunning, right? To recognize that in particular, men have been left out of this economy, that men are no longer outpacing, but being outpaced by women in terms of high school and college education, that this is an economy that rewards education, and that men in particular who traditionally have identified themselves as breadwinners, as heads of family, are feeling left out and challenged in terms of core aspects of their identity by these developments, that the United States is becoming less Christian, more irreligious, that this is changing fundamental norms around gender and sexuality, that all of this is challenging, and the government does not seem to be able to respond to any of this. But let me go to the core, I think, issue that seems to underline this sense that the system of government we have doesn't work to solve the problems we face, and that is immigration. And I've made the case with you. I'm going to just remind you that I don't think we have an immigration crisis in the way in which it's being described by Donald Trump or Steve Bannon, Breitbart, or Fox News, that this is in part a manufactured crisis by right-wing media and the Republican Party, that it turns out that our levels of immigration are actually very healthy for our economy. But nevertheless, you compound everything I just described economically and culturally with the fact that most politicians agree that we have uncontrolled and problematic levels of immigration in America in the 2020s, and that the government has been completely incapacitated in doing anything about this. And so I will add very quickly. I'm sorry, did I pop out of my slides? I think I did something wrong there, but we get right back into them. What the right consensus is among politicians is that we need immigration reform. And I think that's absolutely right. But having said that, our government has been completely incapable, in part, of course, because Donald Trump torpedoed it in the last 6 months. But having said that, again, this is just a winning issue for somebody who is running an anti-institutionalist campaign, who is building on this very broad, widespread, deep sentiment that the political and economic system of the United States does not work for the people of the United States, and it needs to be overhauled. This is why Donald Trump is campaigning not just for the presidency, but to transform the balance of power within the federal government of the United States by fundamentally increasing the power of the presidency and his capacity to rely on executive power to do what Congress does not seem to be capable of doing. And the Supreme Court just got out of the way of executive autocracy. This decision, which, right, occurs in a term in which this division, in which the justices appointed by Republican presidents voted as a bloc without being joined by any justice appointed by a Democratic president, that this bloc, I believe, and I'm struggling a little bit to find data that go back further than 70 years, but I believe we have the highest proportion of purely partisan decisions coming out of the Supreme Court in at least the last 75 years. And so the idea that this is an earthquake in American jurisprudence, again, right, that almost everybody who studies constitutional law did not think that this was going to be the result, that there is a fundamental shift in the balance of power between the branches of our government, that Congress has lost its capacity to check and balance the presidency of the United States, because no matter what law Congress passes, the president is not subject to prosecution for violating that law, right? And that does not give the president the power of the purse. There are still ways in which Congress can check the president, but it substantially reduces executive accountability. Please note, right, that the way in which the American people regarded this decision was the opposite, and by, again, stable, large majorities from what the court held. And this is just characteristic of this court. It seems not to care for what the American people think about what their Constitution means. They regard themselves as the only and final valid interpreter of our Constitution. And so this then needs to be paired with what Donald Trump has indicated he is going to do in his second term as president. This is outlined in Project 2025, which is, on the one hand, a major project of the Heritage Foundation under its new president, Kevin Roberts, and on the other hand, also a project of Stephen Miller's, who is the longstanding Trump advisor on immigration. And this project calls for a vast increase in presidential power. And this goes back to the decision that apparently has now been endorsed by the Supreme Court, the idea that there is, I shouldn't say decision, the theory that it appears to inform the decision that the Supreme Court just reached, which is the theory of a unitary executive, which goes back to the presidency of Ronald Reagan, the way in which Reagan was thwarted, for instance, by career civil servants at the Environmental Protection Agency, who basically said, we know that the president wants us to do something different from what we're doing, but we believe the law requires us to do what we are currently doing, and so we will continue to do it. And Ronald Reagan did not have the power to fire and replace career civil servants. And so what Project 2025 does is aim to give, right, and there's some technical stuff around Schedule F, et cetera, but the President of the United States the power to fire the federal civil service, Kevin Roberts estimates that this may be as many as 50,000 people that Donald Trump would fire in his first year as a second term president, that it would increase the president's control over funds that have been allocated by Congress. It would purge officials who were not willing to do his bidding from the foreign policy administration, the foreign policy apparatus in the American state. It would increase his control over the Justice Department and allow it to be used in more political ways, including perhaps going after journalists who are critical of Donald Trump. And so this is what Kevin Roberts said after the Supreme Court ruled. That Supreme Court ruling yesterday on immunity is vital, and it's vital for a lot of reasons. We are in the process of the Second American Revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be, right? A chilling threat, even perhaps more chilling than anything Donald Trump has said, but a clear indication that there is a movement on the part of those advising Donald Trump, of Donald Trump himself, to increasingly embrace the role of strongman autocrat. The model here is Viktor Orban, the prime minister of Hungary and the architect of the idea of Christian or illiberal nationalism. And so the idea would be to reduce the power and size of the administrative state. Again, the Supreme Court decision from 10 days ago, the decision in Relentless versus the Chamber of Commerce, already diminishes the power of the administrative state. As I put it to you last week, I thought that this decision is a decision that ultimately takes away the way in which, in the New Deal and subsequent, I'm sorry, give me a moment. I'm having trouble with the slides. Let me see if I can get that back. Right, the way in which we modernized the American state, and that involved, among other things, right, what I call grafting an administrative state into the 18th century Constitution. What the Supreme Court has said is that the Congress cannot give broad authority to administrative agencies, and the judiciary is not going to give deference to the judgment of those agencies. This is the judiciary essentially claiming the authority to supervise administrative agencies' use of delegated power, and this will probably undermine much of the environmental law of the United States, perhaps a fair bit of consumer protection and occupational safety legislation as well. We will have to see how much of the regulation of the economy ultimately falls to this new idea as well. But this is, again, a fundamental shift away from administrative agencies into the power of the presidency, and Donald Trump is poised to take advantage of this if elected to the presidency of the United States. To tie this all together for a second, this seems to underline the importance of the Democratic Party working as a party, not just as a vehicle for the ambition of its current candidate, in the way that the Republican Party clearly has essentially surrendered its role as a democratic institution that vets the qualification of its candidate. It is a purely instrumental actor focused exclusively on winning the next election and not on the health of our democracy. And so it is simply doing its candidate's will. The Democratic Party needs to reassert some capacity to discipline its candidates and to work to channel the concerns of the American people about the alternative back to Viktor Orban and the 2025 model for Donald Trump, in addition to increasing the power of the administrative state. Orban is strongly identified with Christian or illiberal nationalism. In other words, if the liberal constitutional rights allow for a diverse multicultural society to take hold, well, too bad for the liberal rights. They need to be scaled back so that the religious majority can reassert its cultural dominance over the country. This includes increasing in Orban's plan the birth rate. Again, this is endorsed by the 2025 project, increasing the birth rate of white Christian Americans so as to prevent the diversification of our society. That's combined, of course, with strict immigration control and deportation and removal of constraints on the executive by the judiciary, by the law, and by the press. And here the Supreme Court seems to be aiding and abetting this fundamental rebalancing of power within our constitutional structure. Sonia Sotomayor was quite clear in expressing her alarm at the implications, at the radicalness of this decision. She did not sign her dissent in the customary way. I respectfully dissent, or I dissent with respect. She says, with fear for our democracy, I dissent. She before that says, never in the history of our republic has a president had reason to believe that he would be immune from criminal prosecution if he used the trappings of his office to violate the criminal law. Moving forward, however, all former presidents will be cloaked in such immunity. If the occupant of that office misuses official power for personal gain, the criminal law that the rest of us must abide will not provide a backstop. And this means, right, that as she puts it, the court effectively created a law-free zone around the president, upsetting the status quo that has existed since the founding. And then she gives these examples: assassinating a rival, taking a bribe in exchange for a pardon, organizing a military coup to hold on to power. He would be immune from all of that. And please note, right, some of this is exactly the kind of conduct that was at stake in this decision. I want to be as clear as possible about this. I think there are two ways to look at the prosecution of former President Trump by the Justice Department's special counsel, Jack Smith. One of them is to say, look, this has never been done in the history of the United States. We have never criminally prosecuted a former president, and this indicates a complete departure from the norms of our society, which is that we don't go use the rule of law to go after our political opponents, and therefore we need to protect ourselves from this and recognize the Constitution as protecting us. The other way to view this is that this has never been done before because no president in the history of the United States has violated the law with the reckless impunity that Donald Trump did, and therefore we need to reassert the principle that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the rule of law. Clearly, I and Justice Sotomayor and many people in the American public, roughly three-quarters of us, believe the second idea. But the majority in the Supreme Court seems to be convinced of the first idea and has made this, for the time being, the law of the land. What this is doing is clear, is it is undermining the perception that the Supreme Court is a non-political branch of our government. The preponderance of decisions in which the Democratic appointees vote in one way, the conservative appointees vote in another, is, as I say, the highest it's been in 75 years. Roughly 20% of the cases in this term were 6-3 cases, with the 6 conservative justices voting together, the 3 liberal justices voting against. The breakdown of consensus on the court, the high rate of concurring opinions, again indicates that this court is fracturing along partisan lines. This right is as the justices are as polarized as really any justices have been, and this is driving down the legitimacy of the court. I go back to the basic theme, the title of today's election. We cannot count on our institutions saving us from our politics. I think for a long time we've relied on the idea that the court will operate in a nonpartisan, non-political way with fidelity to the Constitution to check us, the American people, when a majority of us operate on the basis of passions in ways that we will later probably regret, a transient majority, as we say, that the court will call us to our senses and prevent us from following our worst impulses. This court does not seem to see itself as having that mission. And so I think this could matter hugely for a second term of Trump. Please note that in the Supreme Court in his first term, Trump did rather poorly, or to put it differently, the court checked Trump's use of administrative and executive power more than it did any other president going back to the middle of the 20th century, going back essentially almost 100 years. And that is in part because the use of executive power was so unconstrained by law. And what this means is I think we need to be ready for a fight to take back the court from the current justices. That will be a long, slow fight. Let me be as clear as possible about this, put on my political theory hat for a moment. When Alexis de Tocqueville visited the United States, one of the things, this is in the 1830s, right, that really stood out to him was how much lawyers dominated American politics and populated American institutions of government. And his claim was, not only is it the case that lawyers seem to be the most likely people to be elected to Congress, elected president, to become members of a presidential cabinet or a important branch of government, American lawyers have a distinct culture. It's a culture that involves fidelity to the law and the Constitution more than fidelity to the party. And that in turn restrains and stabilizes American government. And that when the Federalist Society started in the early 1970s, spending hundreds of millions of dollars to remake the federal judiciary, they weren't just putting in place new judges and justices. That was their clear top line objective. But I think even more deeply, they were trying to make or remake American legal culture. And what the decisions of the last few weeks in this term show is that they really have succeeded in doing that. And so we can no longer take for granted the ability of our Supreme Court to check the worst excesses of our politics. Let me just note it wasn't only the case of Trump v. the United States. In other cases, the court also did some fairly radical things. I will, in the near future, have an entire class with you on this term for the Supreme Court, but I want to conclude today on one final idea. And this is something we've talked about together before, but the symbiosis on the right wing of the American political system between a right wing media ecosystem that delivers identity confirming news. We've seen this very clearly with Fox News and the Dominion case. The editors, the producers, the journalists, the opinion people in Fox all knew that what they were saying was false. They said this to each other. They thought it was crazy. They thought it was dangerous. They thought it was BS. And yet they went on the air and repeatedly said that the victory of Joe Biden was a fraud, that Donald Trump had actually won the election. They said this because this is what their public wanted to hear. And in an age of cable TV and social media, if the public doesn't hear what it wants to hear from their station, they can change the channel. Fox's ratings were tanking if they didn't say that Donald Trump had won the election, and so they did not deliver the inconvenient truth to their audience. Instead, they delivered identity confirming news. This allowed their public to continue to believe what they wanted to believe and to continue to demand from politicians that they follow Donald Trump down this path of denialism, of disinformation, of aggrandizement of power, of mistrust of institutions and electoral results. And of course, those politicians got favorable coverage from Fox when they said exactly what the public wanted to hear and what the media was confirming them in saying. I look at this diagram, which was created by Yeshai Benkler, Robert Ferris, and Hal Roberts in 2018, I believe it is, in 2024 in a new light, right? Because in 2018, at least it appeared that the Republican Party still had a mainstream wing that was trying to check Donald Trump, that the Supreme Court and the federal bench were still there to prevent this feedback loop from completely insulating itself from any kind of check balance or reality check dynamic. I think in 2024, again, the courts are not going to help us in the way that they have in the past. The media is not going to help us. The parties, I'm not sure. Will the Democratic Party right its ship, get rid of Joe Biden and try to find a better candidate? Or instead, will even the Democratic Party expose itself as being incapable of doing what we needed to do in 2024? All of this to say, it may increasingly fall to the American people or that portion of us that does not like the direction that our country appears to be headed in to stand up for what we believe, to hopefully prevail in the next election, no matter who the candidate is at the top of the ticket, especially when it comes to the Senate and the House, if we need to check a second term Donald Trump, but then to organize and not just with mass protests in Central Park once or twice in the early days of a presidential administration, but to organize in the way that labor unions organized in the 1930s and 1940s, in the way that the women's movement and the civil rights movement organized in the 1960s and 1970s, to be sustained lasting, independent checks on institutions that are no longer capable of checking each other. I'll stop there. Happy to take your questions or comments. I know I'm a little passionate this week. I'm making an argument with you that I think is extremely important that we take seriously in 2024. 122 days to the election. Thanks, everybody. Who wants to start us out with a question or a comment? David, you look like you're eager to speak. Do I have you right?
Unmuted again. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Uh, I can't remember the name of the organization, but I do know that there's an organization of Republican legislators, not only national, but state level, and they hold conventions. And when they go to these conventions, what they get is model legislation that they can take back to their states. Is it ALEC or something like that?
Exactly.
And
American
they
Legislative Council, ALEC, yeah.
yeah, and they those things show up in state after state. In my own field of little kids reading and literacy, the reason we have laws in 43 states, valorizing the science of reading, is that all these people went to a conference a few summers ago and they got this model legislation and they've been pushing it ever since at the state level. And it seems to me that this organization, whatever we do to try to right the ship, it has to be at every level, local, state, and national. It can't just be a national campaign. And it has to be at the local ward level and things like that, or the organization.
And so I'm going to go back into the slides, David, just for a second, because there's something I didn't emphasize with you when we were talking earlier. Just I kind of slid over this. So this is right, that the decisions that will substantially weaken the administrative state. There's several of them. It's easy to remember: Relentless versus Department of Commerce. I'm sorry. And one of the ways to think of Relentless is to think about the role of David Koch, right? The Koch brothers in relentlessly funding these suits, in relentlessly funding the American Legislative Exchange Council, in relentlessly funding the effort to remake the federal judiciary, the Federalist Society. And so I think when we look at this, conservatives, and please note, right, that these are people who benefit financially substantially when the federal government does not tax and regulate the industries that generate their highly concentrated wealth, does not tax them, right? And so I say all of this to point out that it's not just that we need an outlook of the left. We need models of legislation that counter the conservative models of legislation. If we don't have the donors, and I think that there is a money imbalance here, clearly, then we need some way to rise to the challenge without having to rely on billionaires to fund us. And the labor union movement, social movements, the use of ordinary people's capacity to organize themselves, not simply to get to the ballot, but to work in a concerted way to make it expensive and difficult for conservatives to prevail on these issues. I think that's an essential part of the puzzle, and the last 50 years have seen us retreat from this level of engagement into the privacy of our living rooms, where we get to watch TV and play with our phones and engage on social media. If we're going to not simply rely on institutions to bail us out, but do some of the work ourselves, we're going to have to reverse the trend of civic privatism, reverse the decline of labor unions and social movements, it seems to me.
Yeah, I
Thank
agree with all that. The
you.
only other thing I was going to say was that I think it was Nate Silver, but I can't remember who now, who proposed a kind of that Biden resign. We open up the not only the convention, but between now and the convention, there are these sort of tryouts where you have a national debate and maybe a few opportunities for people to give intact speeches and the like, and that feeds into the convention. I was wondering what you thought of that idea, under the assumption that Biden eventually sees the light.
Yeah, and so I what I hear, and I don't have any inside information on this. I'm just watching the press and reading the papers like everybody else. Is that on the one hand, Biden seems to be putting a brave face on it when he goes in front of the public because that's what he's got to do if he's going to save his candidacy. But that with his donors, advisors behind closed doors, he seems to be aware that he is damaged and that it may be difficult for him to salvage his campaign. And so let's envision that scenario for a moment where the Stephanopoulos interview, in fact, confirms rather than disproving people's suspicion that Joe Biden doesn't have the capacity to be a successful president for another 4 years or to beat Donald Trump 120 odd days from now. So Biden bows out. And then the question is, assuming that he doesn't, I think, recklessly exaggerate his influence by trying to say, and this is my anointed successor, right? I think that would be a real problem for the Democratic Party. Then there has to be some structured process that is highly compressed. We have basically a month between now and the convention. So, will there be debates? Will there be maybe in the way that 21st technology allows some sort of interactive uh, environment in which candidates get questions from their constituencies, the people who are trying to make up their minds about who to vote for. It's not just CNN anchors asking questions, it's ordinary citizens. I think there's a way in which this could really captivate the attention of the American electorate. I'm not saying that there's any guarantee that it will turn out well. It could fracture the party. It could result in 20 votes on the convention floor and people really being bruised and angry about their candidate not carrying the day. But having said that, I don't, I just don't see Joe Biden having a good, clear path to victory anymore. And so I think we have to take the risky step and then figure out. And I do hope that some people are having conversations right now about how to do this. Maybe orderly is too strong a word, but in an open and accountable and captivating way, and in a way that minimizes the substantial risks associated with the whole normal primary nominating process having clearly failed us in 2024. Anybody else with a thought or a question for today? These are heady, difficult issues and times. And I don't know about you. I am frightened. I have a lot of trepidation. There are nights when this interferes with my sleep, but I also feel that there's a little bit more openness in our politics than I felt for a long time. And that one opportunity here would be to say, wait a sec, Biden did all this, and nevertheless, he's not going to get a second term. what more do we need from a politician, from a president in the 21st century to restore some faith and accountability in our political process? That there's an opportunity there as well. Flossie, I see you. Unmute yourself and go ahead. You're muted right now. There you go.
Have a dream.
Uh, Sorry, Flossie, you went from mute to unmute to mute really quickly. One more time.
I have a dream.
Go
The
ahead.
Supreme Court has given the president the right to do anything he chooses now. Biden wins by a slim majority and says, well, I'm your president now. I can do what I please. And the first thing I do is suggest that some of you have committed treason, and I'm going to get you into prison as soon as I can. How? Just the threat, just the idea that the president has the power now to turn around and do what Trump is threatening. That's a possibility. The Supreme Court has given them that hand. It's a nice moment. I don't know that it can ever happen, but it's nice to think about.
And Flossie, I understand the dream, the fantasy, and the appeal of it. And I mean, there's so much anger and disgust directed at the Supreme Court right now by a majority of Americans that I think a lot of us may have some dark fantasies about what we would like to happen to an Alito or a Clarence Thomas. But having said that, be careful what you wish for, right? Because on the one hand, it sets a precedent for the next president. And by the way, let's not get carried away. The Supreme Court didn't say the president of the United States can do whatever he wants to do. It did say that he cannot be held criminally accountable for things related to the core functioning of his office or kind of ill-defined periphery of the functions of his office. I don't think that includes summarily putting people in jail. I think the reason that Sotomayor used assassination as opposed to jailing is because the president is the commander in chief and can order the military to do a number of things. Even that might be a questionable issue because would the members of the military who followed those orders be committing crimes and then themselves be subject to criminal prosecution? And would that restrain them from doing what the president ordered them to do? It will put them in a tricky position because disobeying the commander in chief's order is a violation of the law, but so too is following his order. And so, having said all of that, let's not think we're in Argentina in the dirty wars all of a sudden, right? We're still in America, but we're in an America in which the balance of power within our institutional framework in the federal government between our three branches just shifted dramatically. I see, Hannah, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that actually having sort of an open convention with indeed the arguments going back and forth, with younger people being presented, would indeed get our younger population involved and having more faith again in the fact that we have people in this country that might be able to lead. So I personally think that that is what the Democratic Party needs, is a statement that there is life underneath. It's not just us old fogies with one position or another. It's young people that think they would like to be able to make this country better.
Thank you, Hannah. And I'll say very quickly, right? The Democratic Party has the opportunity to nominate the first post-baby boom person to be a candidate for the president of the United States if Joe Biden will get out of the way. right? And that could be um, a major plus for the Democratic Party to have got there first. And then I would add, the Democratic Party has the possibility in 2024 of saying to the American people, we hear you. We hear that you don't want Joe Biden to be your choice as opposed to Donald Trump, that you don't like either of those choices, and we will respond to you. And it would, I hope, possibly restore some faith, at least if it worked, right? And I don't know if it's Kamala Harris or if it's Gavin
That
Newsom.
won't work.
Well, but
I mean, why do we think that a Black woman has a chance?
well,
I'm sorry. This is America.
I have to plug in because I'm about to run out of electricity here. I guess this is a longer session than usual. Give me one moment, boy. I'm just gonna say, look, the Republican Party made a run with a woman of color. This is 2024. These are younger voters. I am not going to prejudge. And I'm not sure we've heard enough from Kamala Harris to know whether or not she could be an effective presidential candidate. I'll say the same thing about Gretchen Whitmer. I'll say the same thing about Gavin Newsom, Pete Buttigieg. Keep going, right? But having said all of that, um, the fact that whoever it is there because the American people have said we want a different option restores some maybe of the faith in the idea that one of our parties actually listens and does what we want it to do.
I think I want to make a broader statement about my suggestion of the open convention and the young people. I'd like to get the young people in both parties involved. And I think that if you have, it can start with the Democratic Party, but we have a problem of non-voting younger people who have lost faith in the fact that we have a democracy and a functioning government. And I think the excitement of young people happens this time in the Democratic Party, but the fact that we have young people who are interested in the issues that young people have is a positive thing for the United States at this point.
Thank you again, Hannah. And I'm going to share a slide with you for a moment because it's directly relevant to what you're saying. Let me see if I can find it quickly enough. Yeah, it's far down in my slides, but give me a moment. Oh, maybe it's not where I think it is. So I'm going to stop. Let me try very quickly. There it is. So right. How important do you think it is to live in a democracy, right? And the people born in the 1930s, 1940s, the vast majority of them say it's very important to live in a democracy. The people who are born in the 1980s, less than a third of them think that it's important to live in a democracy. Again, I think part of what's paving the way for a potential second Donald Trump presidency is a sense that democracy is a system of government that may have worked well in previous centuries, but doesn't meet the problems of the 21st century. We need a strong man leader to face up to these circumstances. And we need not just somebody who says that's dangerous, don't go down that path, but somebody who presents a credible alternative for restoring the functionality of democracy. Part of that has to do with restoring the process by which we choose our leaders. Primaries, we've got this crazy convoluted system in which 20% of the people in Georgia decide who is viable in a presidential election. It also needs to be fixed. We've gone way over time. David, I see you've got your hand up. Why don't you be quick about it if you can? because we got to wrap this up.
Very quick. Reflecting on your interaction with Fossey about the absolute immunity of the executive, and your comment about assassination, I guess the conclusion is that the president can kill whoever he wants by assassination as long as he does it himself.
Yeah, exactly. Trump can stand on Fifth Avenue and pull the trigger himself. Apparently he's got a good golf game. I don't know how good a marksman he is, but let's not go down that path. Everybody, these are sobering conversations. These are serious days in American politics. As always, it's important for me to be able to share these ideas and think out loud with you. Thank you for the ongoing opportunity. Look forward to seeing you in person next month. Until then, well, until next week, be well and hang in there. Keep your chin up. We've still got some hope. See everybody next week. Thank you, guys. Bye bye.
Thank you, David.
Pleasure as always. Thank you. Bye bye.